It actually feels like the sound is really far away from me, which is so funny. That's more like it. Okay, we can cut there. Hi everyone, I'm Kennan from Cars and Bids, and today we're talking about an unloved Ferrari. This is the Mondial T Cabriolet, and I have heard my whole life that these cars are soft and squidgy and not that much fun to drive. But I have always been curious about this car, and I want to see if those myths happen to be true. But first, we're going to be talking all about this car's facts and figures. First, we'll talk about where it fits into Ferrari's past, then we'll get nerdy and talk about some of those technical details, and then I'll do what I really want to do and take this thing for a drive. Before we get going though, que sorpresa, this Mondial T is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. As I mentioned, this is a T model, which means that it comes with the naturally aspirated 3.4 liter V8 that was shared with the Ferrari 348. This one also has the desirable gated 5-speed manual transmission, and it has just over 23,500 miles on its odometer. And if you've been in the market for one of these, after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below where you can head to the live auction of this one, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. We begin the story of the Mondial by first discussing its name. Now, Ferrari has a tradition of using names from the past with their current generation sports cars, and the Mondial was no different. We see it today with cars like the 812 Superfast, which was named after a race car from the 1950s, and we've also seen it with cars like the Ferrari 599 GTO and things like that. Ferrari keeping those monikers alive. Now, the Mondial traces its name back to the 500 Mondial from the 1950s. That was a 4-cylinder race car that Ferrari developed to be used in conjunction with their V12 race cars. Ferrari realized that other manufacturers were using 4-cylinder power, and they were getting relatively close to the performance figures of the V12 cars because they weighed so much less. And so Ferrari set out to develop a series of 4-cylinder race cars, and that was the 500 Mondial. The first part of that car's name, 500, comes from its displacement. Each cylinder displaced 500 cubic centimeters, hence the name. But the name Mondial came from the car's success on the racetrack. Now, Mondial comes from the French adjective for worldly, and that car won 2 Constructors' World Championships under the driving of Alberto Ascari. So it got the name 500 Mondial. Now, this car got its name not for racing necessarily, but it got its name because this is a world-designed Ferrari, meaning that it met the crash standards of the world and the emission standards as well. So Ferrari thought it was fitting to call it a Mondial, as it was their worldly car. Now, as Doug discussed in his video, this car exists because Ferrari wanted to make a more attainable, more usable car available to the public. But it replaced a car that Ferrari was already targeting to do that with, the 308 GT4. Now, that car is significant in Ferrari's history for 2 reasons. One is that it was the only Bertone-designed Ferrari with its crazy-looking, really angular design, and it was the first V8 mid-engine Ferrari. That's right, you can trace the lineage of the 458 Speciale all the way back to the humble 308 GT4. Regardless, that car wasn't a huge seller for Ferrari. They realized that there was a market demand for it, but the car needed to be less compromised. And so in 1980, they introduced the Mondial, first as a coupe, and then in 1982, they introduced the Cabriolet convertible version, which was specifically designed to target the US market, which liked convertible cars for our warm climates over here. The Cabriolet version is particularly noteworthy because it was the first fully convertible Ferrari since the Daytona Spider. Ferrari had made cars that have liftable roof-out targa panels like the 308 GTS, but they hadn't done a fully convertible Ferrari in some time. And so for the Mondial, they thought it would be appropriate to reintroduce that fully convertible design. Ferrari would also build the Mondial in several different series, and they would parallel the engines that were found in the mid-engine V8 sports cars of the time. The first car, the Mondial 8, shared its V8 with the Ferrari 308, then came the Mondial QV, the 3.2, and lastly this, the T, which shared its engine with the newly designed 348. During this time though, the Mondial developed a reputation for not being particularly fast. Those early Mondial 8s didn't have a ton of power, but over the life cycle of the car, Ferrari would increase the power level as they would change each engine, making it more and more drivable and even more fun. The Mondial was a relatively successful model for Ferrari, as they would make about 6,200 of these for the whole world. Of those, about 1,500 would come to the United States, but of that total number, only about 379 were the T Cabriolet version. So seeing one of these cars in person is frankly a relatively rare sight. Now it's time to talk about the design of the Mondial, and we first have to discuss the 308 GT4 that came before it. With the Mondial, Ferrari wanted to address a couple of different things. They wanted to offer more models of the Mondial, such as a convertible, and they wanted to make it more ergonomic and easier to use. As a result, they changed the dimensions of this car dramatically. They made it a full 10 centimeters longer than the 308 GT4, and they made the front track 37 millimeters wider, and they widened the rear track by 57 millimeters. The result is that this car is substantially bigger than the 308 GT4 it replaced. But that wasn't the only thing that Ferrari wanted to do. They wanted to introduce another model into the range. Now, the 308 GT4 was only ever offered as a hardtop, a 2+2 seater hardtop. But this car, they wanted to offer a convertible, and so they gave it this fully convertible top. They also went to extreme lengths to make sure that the convertible version of this car with the top up mimicked the silhouette of the coupe model. Now, I'm not going to put the top up and down in this car, as Doug has already done that in his video, but needless to say, this car did retain the design that Ferrari was looking for between the coupe and the convertible models. This design would not stick around with Ferrari for very long though. They realized that having a car that has a trunk in the front, 4 seats in the middle, a convertible top, an engine, and another trunk was a lot to squeeze into one package. And so later in the 1990s, the Mondial would fade away. It wasn't until the Ferrari California that Ferrari would bring back another 4-seater V8 powered car, but for that car, they moved the engine to the front. And so the Mondial remains this kind of unusual car that came from Ferrari's wedge-shaped era. And now it's time to talk about the star of the show with any Ferrari, and that of course is its engine. Now, as I mentioned, the Mondial shared its engines in parallel with the mid-engine V8 Ferrari of the time, the 308. Then came the QV, the 4-valve V8, and then the 3.2-liter engine, which was found in the 328, and lastly, this, the 3.4-liter V8 found in the Ferrari 348. This engine produces 300 horsepower and 239 foot-pounds of torque, meaning that the Mondial can get from 0 to 60 miles an hour in 6.3 seconds. Now, while that doesn't sound all that fast, you have to remember this was the late 1980s, so those performance numbers are plenty adequate for a car like this. This car was also heavy by the standards of the day, weighing about 3,200 pounds. Again, a light figure by today's standards, but by the standards of the late 1980s, this was certainly no featherweight. But bringing the 3.4-liter V8 into this car and adding all of its performance wasn't accidental. Ferrari introduced a lot of technology into this platform, including dry sump lubrication. Now, what is dry sump lubrication and why does it matter? Dry sump lubrication means that the entire oiling system is separate from the engine. There's no reservoir attached to the bottom of the engine where the oil sits, like in most traditional cars. As a result, it means that the engine can be mounted significantly lower in the car, lowering the center of gravity, making the car handle even better. But there are other benefits more than that. It also means that the engine is more reliable as the oil pumps are external to the engine, meaning they can be replaced easily. You're also able to regulate cooling significantly better, and you can regulate oil pressure much better, meaning that a car with a dry sump lubrication system is significantly more reliable. And that was one of the key things that Ferrari wanted to introduce with this engine. So not only did it get more power and more performance, but it also got more technology to make the Mondial T more reliable. This wide selection of engines wasn't the only thing that Ferrari would introduce with the Mondial. For this car, they would also introduce a subframe, which the engine, transmission, and suspension components all attached to. And the idea was that these engines were going to have to be taken out of these cars for service, which is certainly not easy. But because they come out as one single lump, it makes it much easier to remove and reinstall them to the car. This was racing technology that Ferrari had used with their Formula One cars, and they wanted to introduce it here. Now granted, that's not as easy as living with a modern car, but by the standards of the day, it made the Mondial easier to live with than its predecessor. The last thing I want to talk about with this engine would be its engine management system. Ferrari was using more computers in these cars, and they were using the Bosch Botronic 2.5 system and later 2.7 system with the T to make sure that everything with the engine was running correctly and to make sure that it was optimized and running efficiently. The reason I note this as being important as, well, that showed that this car was becoming more modern. As this car would age, Ferrari was still putting modern technology in this car to make it, again, more reliable and more usable. But the mechanical innovations didn't end with just the engine and transmission. Ferrari would also do a lot of work on the suspension of this car. They gave it a fully independent wishbone suspension at all four corners, and they would also introduce the adjustable damper system into this car. There's a little switch located on the interior of this car that allows the driver to choose between soft, medium, and hard suspension settings with this car. And at the time, in the 1980s and early 1990s, that was cutting-edge technology. Now, it was great to have in a car like this because although this was more GT focused and this open top car, it meant that the chassis wasn't exactly stiff. But being able to increase the stiffness of the dampers meant that if you wanted to drive this car in a more sporty manner, you could do so by simply pressing a button. And now we're in the interior of the Mondial T, and the thing I want to talk about would be the transmission found in this car. Now, Doug has mentioned it in his video, but this car is equipped with the standard gated 5-speed manual transmission. But there was another transmission available in this car, and it was the Vallejo transmission. But the difference with the Vallejo transmission is that you got to row your own. You still got to click-clack through the classic Ferrari gate, you just didn't have a clutch pedal to operate. Now, this was nothing new, as Porsche had done this with their Sport-O-Matic transmission, but Ferrari wanted to introduce it into this car to again make this one even more easy to drive. But as I mentioned, this car does not have that transmission. It has the standard 5-speed manual, but it's not really a complaint from me because there's nothing I can think of that's more pleasurable than shifting your own gears in a manual transmission Ferrari. Okay, we're driving the Ferrari Mondial. Now, as I mentioned, this is kind of self-serving because I've always been curious about what this car drives like. I've seen them obviously for many years around, and like I've just always been curious, like, you know, and it has this perception of it not being a good Ferrari, and I've just like been curious, like what's it actually like? Right away, my impressions are it's cool. Like, old Ferraris are just cool. This car feels like that to me. It's buzzy and exotic, and the gauges are so deeply 1980s. And it has that era Ferrari thing to it. It's kind of hilarious. The other thing that strikes me right away is the sound. Like, it's still got that great Ferrari V8 noise. Although because of the length of this car, it actually feels like the sound is really far away from me, which is so funny. The layout of this car is just so unusual. I mean, listen to that. Like, it sounds awesome. I'm not gonna lie, I think it sounds great. The gated shifter, obviously, in any Ferrari is just amazing. When I had my 355, I thought that it would be like overrated, but no. It really isn't. And it doesn't like second gear till it's warmed up. I just started driving this car, so it's a little cold, but I'm sure that will get nicer as the gearbox gets more temperature into it. I'm stunned at like the ground clearance the car has. Like, it really can clear pretty much all these little speed bumps I'm going over. With my 355, I was constantly worried about it scraping on stuff. But I think this car, like, it further underscores this was supposed to be the usable Ferrari. This was supposed to be the Ferrari you could drive, that was accessible to people to buy, but also made it just very easy to drive. The sound delivers the Ferrari sound. All right, here we go. We'll get on it just a little bit. Going around a roundabout. Woo! It's fun. Here we go. Oh, come on. Oh, it's so much fun. And it's not slow. It's not like break your neck fast either, but it's not slow. I'm so surprised at that. Like, that's so much fun. Oh, the downshifts are nice. All the pedal weights are really good. This is a fun car. This is so much better than I was expecting it to be, just based on what other people had told me about Mondials. But I think this car is hilarious, and it just. Oh, man, it's fun. I love this car way more than I was expecting. The interior ergonomics of this car are hilarious. You can't really fit in the back. You know, it's it's just like, ergonomics were not even a thought for Ferrari with this car, and like that tracks, to be honest with you. I also adore this steering wheel. I think the steering wheel is one of the most elegant steering wheels ever put in a Ferrari from this era, and I love the layout, and it's nice, no buttons whatsoever. 3 places to honk the horn, so bizarre. Honestly, it's a fun cabin to be in. When you're just driving it by yourself, you wouldn't want to be in the back of this car necessarily, but just driving around, it's fun. The suspension is in fully firm mode, and frankly, I don't want to touch it. I'm not brave enough to push that button. I never did with my 355, but like, the handling is like fine for what it is. This isn't like the out and out sports car Ferrari, but like, I think if you're just gonna drive it around at like 6 or 7 tenths and just like enjoy listening to that sound, I think the handling is more than adequate to just like have fun and enjoy. This thing is narrow. I can reach the other door panel just by extending my hand. So it's not a big car. It doesn't really take up a whole lot of room as you're driving around. So to kind of break it down, a couple of things I really love. The clutch action in this car is great. It's very much what I remember with my 355. The shift action once the gearbox is warm is really nice. And the sound of that 348 derived engine is really good. Just sounds, it's the Ferrari V8 sound, is what you expect. Also, I have to say, this car still gets a lot of looks. I know maybe some of them are like kind of inquisitive based on like the proportions of this car, but people still look at it. You just don't see vintage Ferraris or old Ferraris of any kind that are wedgy and exotic looking driving around. It's not a common sight. It's a fun, silly Ferrari. This is not a Ferrari you use to set lap times. This is not a Ferrari you necessarily flex on people with. This is a Ferrari you drive to enjoy yourself and just have a good time with, and man, is it fun at that. It's just so good at that. And that is the Mondial T Cabriolet. As I said, I've always been told that these cars are no good, but that's simply not true. Granted, it's not a knife-edge racer Ferrari, but it delivers the vintage Ferrari driving experience that you would expect with one of these. It's more of a fun car than I expected, and it's not really a dog of a car at all. And if you've been in the market for one of these, well, you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll talk to you later. Goodbye. Good boy, Noodle.